All right, welcome to Introduction of Criminal Justice. That's CJC 111 here, Wake Tech. We're moving on to Chapter 5 in our text, which is Criminal Justice in Action, 11th edition, again by Gaines and Miller. We're moving out of this first four chapters, which really covered a lot of the basic information, gave us a little bit of a historical background, a little bit of the practical background of the entire criminal justice system very quickly, very shallowly. Now we're going to move on to looking at our first major unit where we're drilling down a little bit. We're going to look at the police today, law enforcement more properly, I guess. So if you're ready, let's go on. Of course, I always like to start off by asking some questions because I want you to read critically. I want you, when you go in there, to say, okay, what does this mean? I mean, I know you gave me a fact. Why are you giving me this fact? You started talking about this. Why did you choose to talk about this and not that? So here are some things to kind of keep around, bat around in the back of your mind. We're going to talk about the structure of the police, and we'll talk about how it is a paramilitary model with ranks and very well-defined hierarchy. And it's fair to ask, okay, even though this is something we experience every day, why? What's the advantages of this military model? Why do we use a military model as opposed to a medical model or a religious model or whatever other alternatives are out there, or maybe developing a completely unique one? So what are the advantages to using this military model? What are the disadvantages? The next one's a little bit contentious, but I think it's worth keeping in your mind. What is the goal of diversity and how can it be measured? And this first sub-question here, I think, is something I'd like you to really think about deeply. Is diversity a goal or a means to accomplish a goal? Now, it obviously can be both. But when you say, I want a diverse police department, I want a diverse judiciary, is it because diversity is what you want, or is diversity going to accomplish something that you want? So when we start to talk about diversity inside the criminal justice system, or the lack of diversity inside the criminal justice system, what are you looking for? Is the lack of diversity causing a problem? Will new diversity solve that problem? All interesting things. The second question is, how do you measure success of this? If diversity is your goal, then success is simply measured by counting how many different diverse groups are included. But if you're saying, well, by having diverse groups we accomplish something, your analysis becomes more complex. Final thing to keep in mind is we're very used to, as Americans, living in a kind of a three-tiered structure of law enforcement. You got your local police and sheriffs, you got your state, your highway patrol or state police, and then you've got the federal police. So is this a good thing? Should police be divided like this, or should they be unified? Should there be a single police department across the United States? And if so, how? I mean, some countries do this, some very large countries do this, or have greater integration between law enforcement or less. So does dividing it up this way between local, federal, state make it more or less efficient? What problems does this division create? What problems does it solve? I guess I have to change that from do to do, but I'll do that in cleanup if that's all right. Okay, these learning objectives, again, you see these all the time. They're not terribly important for you to look at, but certainly something that we hope to accomplish by looking at these chapters. Okay, these are your kind of stated purposes, responsibilities of the police. So the one that we think of, I guess, if you ask the average citizen, what do the police do? The obvious answer is, well, they enforce the law. Maybe they catch bad guys. But it's viewed as their primary goal. But one of the things, if you go to work for the Raleigh Police Department, or if you go to work in Durham, or if you go to work for the FBI, is that's great to think about it in that way, but in fact the police don't do a lot of that directly. There are other things they do. One of the things they do is they provide services. So if you think about a regular police officer in a medium-sized American city, and you said, what's the most common thing he does during the day? It's probably going to involve traffic control in some ways. So they might spend most of their time responding to an accident in traffic, or that a light is out on a highway, or there's been an accident and traffic needs to be directed around. I mean, we spend a tremendous amount of time doing that. We also provide services like, officer, I heard a noise. I'm afraid there might be someone breaking into my house or something, and the police come. They're not necessarily enforcing a law, except maybe indirectly for burglary. They're providing a service, a degree of security. Even driving around in police, remember, the perception of having the police is very important. Preventing crime. This is something a lot of, I guess, particularly politicians say, the police prevent crime. Now, I'm not saying they don't prevent crime. What I'm saying is that's a minor part of what the police do. The police actually are primarily a reactive organization as we structure them today. The crime occurs, you call the police, they come investigate, they catch the guy. Now, they indeed may be preventing crime in the future if you can show that the guy they caught is going to commit more crimes in the future. Then they are preventing it. But a lot of crime is one-off, particularly very serious crimes like murder. So that's not, in fact, a lot of what the police do. They don't prevent a lot of certain types of crime, we'll say. Preserve the peace. This is related to both preventing crime, but also handling a situation. The police are the representatives of our government to us. It's who we see. And the police have responsibility to keep society civil. Okay. There are some other duties that are stated or not overtly stated, either because we assume and we understand it, or that's simply something that's unquestioned. So one of the things to remember is the police are the ultimate repositories of force in our society. And we have to ask, when have we decided to give to the police the authority to use force in a situation, and when not? So when we go, say, to arrest a drug dealer, it's okay to use a no-knock warrant. When we go to arrest an embezzler, we say, well, no, that level of force is inappropriate. If you go to arrest a pharmacist who has been improperly supplying opiates to people, which, part of this opiate scandal that rocked the United States, we're going to use a different level of force, and we're going to use the police in a different way than if we go to arrest a drug dealer on the streets. You have to understand that the police enforce moral standards, some of which get translated into our criminal law. And these moral standards advance social, economic, political, and moral goals. Some very positive, like protect the weak, care for children, help the injured. Some of which could be a little bit uglier, like enforce this moral code against this group that we don't like in society, like how Jim Crow was enforced in America. Okay, there are other duties of the police. So, as I said, protecting the status quo. The moral code is how we behave, but it's also shaped as how we think. And no organization, if we look at how they advance these, exists in a vacuum. The police are not exceptions to this. All right. At the beginning, crime control was not the primary focus of early American police departments. Yes, it was important. Yes, it was a component, but it wasn't seen as primary. It was more about controlling groups of people, sometimes even helping them by controlling them. Very early on, if we look at the very early systems of policing, colonists brought over from England the night watch system. So all physically fit males were required to offer their services to protect the community. This kind of goes even to the idea of a militia, or if we fast forward to the 1850s or 60s in the American West, the posse, or sometimes called the posse comitatus. But as American society changed, because if you looked at America in 1776, at the beginning of the American Revolution, and you looked at it in 1876 and 1976 and 2020, one of the things you're going to see is we go from being a very, very rural society where the vast majority of people were engaged in agriculture and were living on farms. By the 20th century, the majority of people are no longer living in the rural environment. By the 21st century, it's only a small percentage of people who are farming and in the rural environment. So we have this urban and rural split. The sheriffs, which are a very, very old institution, they were properly called in England. In English, the counties were called shires. People that were in important office were called reeves, R-E-E-V-S. A shireve, the county official, became our sheriff. And they were important, very powerful political figures. Still are in North Carolina, for example. If you go into rural North Carolina, the sheriff is an important political figure. He provides jobs. He is the obvious face of the county government. So in rural areas, the sheriffs were both law enforcement and powerful political figures. Also social. So we see them, two examples. In the Wild West, you have the posse comitos, or the posse. You've all seen Western movies, I assume. You also have in the American South, prior to the Civil War, slave patrols. Gradually, as we become more urban, as people move into these cities, the sheriff becomes less important. And we have the rise of modern police departments. And to govern these cities, we have urban political machines, organizations, like the Tweed gang in New York. These were very political. They didn't get rid of the politics that we saw in the sheriff's departments. They remained very political and did things you wouldn't think urban police departments do. They ran, for example, homeless shelters. They fed people. In many ways, these police departments functioned as social welfare groups. Okay, so where do we get our modern policing? When does this all start? Well, again, we're going to have to go back to England, like we did with the sheriffs and the birth of the common law we talked about. London had developed into one of the largest cities in the world, certainly one of the largest English-speaking cities in the world, and it became increasingly difficult to govern England and London by extension, because there was no way to keep the peace. And sometimes they literally had to call in the army, and they had to suppress riots or insurrections or protests with force. And this was seen as a bad idea. So around about 1829, the English Parliament charged Sir Robert Peel with the creation of a new force called the police, the City of Westminster, City of London, and it was designed to really avoid the necessity to call the army in. The public were supposed to be the police were supposed to be the public. We'll look at some of the rules of Sir Robert Peel, and if you study police operations, you'll spend a good deal of time on this. But Peel creates the first modern police force, and Robert Peel, nickname for Robert is Bob, so we still call policemen in London bobbies. You rarely hear them called peelers, but it was a common name at one point. And he creates this, and he established rules for them. One of the things is he didn't want them to look like the army, and he didn't want the people to feel like, okay, here's the army again, they're going to shoot us. He wanted to integrate the people and the police. So one of the statements of Sir Robert Peel's, and there's a number of them, is that the people are the police and the police are the people. And that law enforcement was supposed to be the two of them working together. Now, American policing, we began to adopt it, and most of the large cities in America began in the North and the Midwest. So you have the big cities. Philadelphia was for a while the largest city in the United States, and then New York took over and maintains it through today. But Boston, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cincinnati, Columbus, you'll notice those are a northern tier. But if you went south, Baltimore, you had a few southern cities like New Orleans, but it was late. So the first police departments really developed in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. So we have this evolution. From about 1740 to about 1840, almost 100 years, we have this precursor of a system, and then we have the first early police departments. And then after the 1840s, we really start to focus on modern police departments inside cities. And we call this the political era of policing, because in many ways it was a form of corruption in which the political party, and it didn't matter which one, Republican, Democrat, or they had different names, Whig, ran the city, but they used the police to reinforce their power. They'd hire their people. They would give favors through the police and use the police. Obviously, this led to some corruption, and the police were perceived as corrupt. So around about the 1930s, we have a reform era where we say, okay, let's professionalize the police. Let's separate them from the politicians. And in fact, at the same time, what they were doing is they were separating them from the public. And let's take it away from the politicians. Let's have police chiefs run it. Let's give the cops better salaries, working conditions, and begin to train them. And by the end of this period, they were recruiting women and minorities, but there was very little focus on public relations, because I think it was this idea that you didn't want to reinfect the police with this old political model by tying them too close to the public. There were problems with this. This reform era had drawbacks. The police were so separate that they were not as effective in law enforcement. And there tended to be more civil disturbances. So by the 1960s and 70s, it became obvious that the police were having a problem controlling the streets. So police developed more community relations. This is the birth of community policing, at least through the 2000s, and then we have 9/11. So typically this is a cycle. Public systems are created, they become mature, they're seen as corrupt or in need of reform, and they're fixed. Okay, and then they mature, they're seen as corrupt and reformed, and then they're fixed. And you just see this cycle. And often because they expand their mission, or we ask them to do things that they're really not well suited to do. And police departments are no exception. So one of the things police departments will do is they'll move between the sort of crime control model. They catch the bad guys, they punish the bad guys, as opposed to the due process model is they preserve the peace and they make sure that the innocent don't suffer. Now today, sometimes it's called intelligence-led policing, and many law enforcement believe this community policing era ends at 9/11, and you have a shift really into two major areas: counterterrorism and technology. So this intelligent-led policing means in part that the police are charged with collecting massive amounts of data, analyzing that data, mapping that data, and seeing the patterns of crime. This, by the way, potentially can make them better at predicting crime and possibly preventing it. So high-tech policing, real-time crime prevention, where you're going to utilize things like computers or cameras to predict what's going to happen and lower crime that way. And an example I use is in Milan, Italy. The police gathered a tremendous amount of information about robberies of pharmacies. In Italy, pharmacies do more than just dispense drugs. They're kind of like convenience stores everywhere in the city of Milan. And one police officer did an analysis, and he figured out, okay, these pharmacies tend to get robbed between these hours in these locations. And they redeployed police assets, and they were able to dramatically lower, in some cases by 50%, the number of robberies. So here they really were shifting to something we'd like the police to do, but there's not a lot of evidence they do, which is crime prevention. Now there can be a problem with gathering data, because sometimes what happens is you can get data and you can measure things with that data, but the questions become, are you just creating goals to match your data, or is your data being used to create goals? So examples, you can measure certain things. You can measure objectively, so there's no question about it. You can measure how many arrests are made. But do arrests really mean you're doing a good job? So if you say, oh, well, the police made 50 more arrests this year or 100 more arrests this year, oh, great, they're doing a really good job. Well, maybe not. Maybe if your standard of data you're gathering is, did you make important arrests? That's a nuance that can be lost in data. And also, you have to worry, and civil libertarians will worry, that you are creating a state that is keeping an eye on everybody. It's a surveillance state. Okay, let's talk a little bit about de-escalation of the police. There are, in a given year, about 50 million interactions that result in some type of violence. Now, this is not a shooting, this is not a murder, and it runs all the way from them laying hands on the police to actually shooting, vice versa. And the negative consequences, if these violent encounters don't go well, can go all the way from an embarrassment to a fatality. And that is on both sides. It can be a civilian that gets embarrassed, or a cop that gets embarrassed, or a cop that gets killed, or a civilian that gets killed, and anything in between. So one of the things we are exploring with the police is to de-escalate, to prevent violence from moving upward. So obviously, you want to understand the situation you're in. You want to have situational awareness. You understand, okay, this is a situation that could go violent. I need to behave in certain ways. And you need to train officers to understand, to recognize the situation. And obviously the preferred response is verbal. Please do what I want, and they conform. Or, don't react this way. Let's talk about it. You want to avoid language that can escalate. And one of the things is, are you giving an order, or are you trying to gain compliance otherwise? And it's sometimes hard for people in position as authorities, when their authority is being challenged, to accept, well, I'm going to have to negotiate about this. Very often, if you're in charge, you want to say, well, it's my way or the highway. You also want to figure out what the root issue is. Is it a language issue? Is it a medical issue? What's going on? And you want to increase distance very often. By that I mean, do you want to be directly in a situation where if he goes for your gun, the only thing you can do is shoot? Maybe you want to back off a little bit. Maybe you want to talk. Maybe you want to have more people present. Maybe you want to have people present that can handle the situation better. Another kind of split we see in this 21st century is the warrior guardian, as is talked about in your text. So one trend is the rise of the warrior cop, and this is the cop that is seen as a crusader against crime. And as a crusader, they're going to look like soldiers. They're going to look like knights. They're going to have war-based technology. They're going to have body armor. They're going to have, all sorts of tools. But they're going to look like a soldier. Now, the alternative is the guardian, where the cop is non-confrontational. He is integrated with the community. He's there to protect the community first, not to police it. And this can conflict. These two things can conflict with one another. So one of the things I said is it led to surveillance and also terrorism, dealing with terrorism, because 9/11 was a shock to the American system. But most terrorism is not foreign terrorism. Most terrorism is domestic. So the public perception seems to be that the leftist groups are the greatest threat. Now, historically, this has happened in American history. If you went to the turn of the century, early 1900 in America, and you said, okay, who's setting off bombs in public? It's going to be leftist anarchists, groups. They even assassinated the president. William McKinley, James Garfield, disappointed office seekers, and anarchists tended to do things like that. But the public perception today is, okay, you got to worry about groups from the left. Probably this is not probably, it is inaccurate. In fact, most terrorist organizations, both historically and currently, seem to be rightist in structure. I'm not saying conservative, I'm saying right wing, and there can be a difference between a conservative and someone that's on the extreme right wing. Probably the most famous example historically in the United States is the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan is clearly not a leftist organization. They're virulently anti-race. They're racist. They're homophobic. They're religious bigots, and they killed thousands of people in the United States, and beat people, and abused people, and stole and destroyed property for more than 100 years, from the close of the American Civil War, which is the first Klan. There's actually three different Klans, all the way through to today, and the Klan still exists today, although it's a shadow of itself. They killed thousands of people, and that is a right-wing organization. Now, frequent debate will exist when we talk about counterterrorism, if counterterrorism is domestic, and if you can broadly divide, and I think you got to be careful when you divide groups into just left and right. But if you do that, there is often debates that the police are not truly neutral, that they favor right-wing groups. So if you look, for example, at the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, did the police, who was present in the crowd, for example, did the storming? Were there leftists? No, it was primarily rightists. In fact, there were actually police officers off duty in that crowd. Flip that. If that group that had stormed the Capitol and had threatened to hang Mike Pence and kidnap Nancy Pelosi had been leftist, if those had been people with sickles and banners, if they'd been communists, what would the reaction have been? So most often left groups bear the brunt of physical abuse, but some rightist groups feel that they're subject to overt discrimination. So you will hear rightist groups saying, the state, the government's out to get us. All right, so let's move on. It's a little bit contentious. Let's talk about the police structure. First of all, if you want to be a cop, you're going to go through a background check. You're going to have your criminal record check. You're often going to take psychological test to determine if you're stable. There's going to be driving tests. There's going to be a credit history test to see that you're not in debt and therefore potentially subject to bribery. You got certain basic requirements. You have to be a U.S. citizen. Generally, there's no felony convictions. You have to have a driver's license because a lot of this is driving cars. 21 years of age. There's height and weight and eyesight requirements. There's background checks and tests. We talked about those. And educational requirements. So let's briefly talk about that. I'm very familiar with Raleigh Police Department. So if you look at who gets hired at the Raleigh Police Academy, you're going to see that everybody has a high school degree. And many of them have college degrees going into the academies. If you're a master officer in Raleigh, you have to have at least a 2-year degree. You can't get promoted to sergeant or above without it in Raleigh. And that's going to be true in a lot of departments. Training. So there's really kind of a two-part process. First, you're going to have the academy, and then you're going to have the field training. So the training overall, I think it depends on what organization you're talking about. If you're a small rural police department in Montana, I'm going to guarantee your level of training is probably not as high as the Boston Police Department or the Raleigh Police Department. So most of the larger police departments will go through academy training. And it's a kind of a paramilitary boot camp where you're going to be taught, in a military environment, you're going to be taught the essentials of law enforcement, including what the laws are, search, seizure, arrest, interrogations, weapons, the whole 9 yards. After you complete that, you're going to go out and you're going to work with actual police officers. And that's going to be usually your FTO, your field training officer. And you're going to apply what you learned to the streets. Okay, what about, and this is where we start to approach diversity, what about women and minorities in policing? Now, over the past 20 years, many police departments have actively tried to recruit, and this is really for some of these groups even longer, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, women, and other minorities. And some of this has to do with anti-discrimination law, because if you looked at police departments, say in the middle of the 20th century, 1950, they would be almost exclusively male, almost exclusively white. And if you fast forward to today, it's going to be different. So we do say that if you are discriminating, if you're saying I'm only going to hire this group, only going to hire the majority group, that's discrimination. Now, discrimination occurs when An individual's characteristics impact hiring, and that can be gender and race. It also can be ethnicities. And since the 1970s, we have created affirmative action programs in the United States to increase the diversity. So what you've said is, since we have almost no women, since we have almost no whatever group we want to talk about, Hispanics, blacks in the police department, we're going to actively try to hire more of them. Now, let's talk about women here, because now women aren't strictly speaking a minority. You have to remember that the majority of people in the United States are women, by a very small number, so they're not truly a minority hire. If a woman gets hired as a cop, they often face added scrutiny, where they have to prove themselves. And many male officers can have the attitude that women are weak or unsuited for police departments. I think that's a dying attitude, but I think it's something that, in our society, there's a clear level of misogyny. There's also can be the belief of tokenism, and you can hear this expressed against any group like women or minorities that are hired, where the only reason you're there is because you're fulfilling a diversity requirement. If we look at women, there appears to be very little difference between the performance of men and women in uniform. Now, of course, on some extremes, people said, they were going to be a disaster, they weren't going to be able to do their job, you can't have women cops. And that proved to be just a silly argument. And then there were some people that said, women are just going to be perfect law enforcers. They're going to de-escalate situations. And in fact, there's not a lot of difference in application between men and women. What about race and ethnicity? Now, you can have, of course, people that have all these issues. You can have minority officers who are different races, different ethnicities, or different genders. And often white police officers believe that there is preferential treatment for them. And minority officers, of course, can even face internal opposition from their own groups, like you are a traitor. And the classic example here is an Uncle Tom if you're a cop. Is there a benefit? Well, here's where we get to that debate about, very early on I said, what's your goal and what's your means? Is diversity your goal? Or is by having a police department that's diverse a means to accomplish something? And it may not be one or two of those overall duties. You might get better relationships that may lead you to the ability to solve crimes, or it may not. Does diversity work? Common wisdom says more police departments will give better services, better law enforcement. The problem with this is that's a great theory, but can you demonstrate it? Can you show with peer-reviewed work? That is, can you look at two police departments, one of which is exclusively or almost exclusively white and male, and the other that has diversity? I don't care whether you're looking at gender diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and controlling for all the variables. Can you say that the diverse department works better? And if so, when you say works better how? Is the public perception better in one or the other? Are your solve rates better in one or the other? So I'm not going to answer this question for you. I'm not going to say yes it is or no it isn't. I'm going to challenge you to go out there and find good peer review articles. Now, don't go out and read an article from the New York Post or from, don't go watch something on, the Antifa channel or the Fox channel or something. Go out and find real, definitive, good work, peer-reviewed, where people have looked at the data that was produced and say, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't work. All right, let's talk a little bit about overall law enforcement. There are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and they employ about 1 million people, of which almost 900,000 are sworn law enforcement, and they operate at 3 different levels: local, state, and federal. So let's talk about the local structure. Most of the cops you're ever going to meet are at the local structure. So here, using the example of Raleigh, North Carolina, County of Wake, most officers with arrest powers work in small or medium-sized police departments. So yeah, you have some huge police departments like LAPD, Chicago Police Department, New York Police Department. But most police departments are medium sized, like Raleigh's, which is approximately 700, 750 officers if it's at full strength. But it can be smaller ones. I mean, you could go to a very small police department like Wendell or Fuquay. Municipal departments have the broadest authority to apprehend suspects, maintain order, and provide services because most of us live in cities and towns. Now, stepping outside of that, we have our sheriffs. Our sheriffs are county-wide. So here in Raleigh, our county is Wake. So there's a Wake County Sheriff. And now most people live in cities or in the areas immediately around cities. So sometimes sheriff's authorities bleed over very close to the city. The size varies dramatically, but they do investigate crimes, and most sheriffs run the jails. They carry out civil and criminal process, that is, they actually serve legal papers. Some of them collect taxes, and they enforce court orders. There's also, and we're not going to talk about this barely at all, but just to mention it, there are county coroners locally, and these can determine cause of death. And this can be important because if the county coroner says this was a homicide, it's going to trigger a police investigation. Here's North Carolina. The large cities, for example, Raleigh, are municipals, and you have smaller ones like Fuquay. Then you have your counties like Wake, and North Carolina has coroners and medical examiners. 9 of our counties have elected ones. Medical examiners are basically part-time appointed county workers. All right, so let's look at the state level, which is going to be different. 50 states in the United States, with one exception, Hawaii, push that an outlier, so 49 that we're concerned about. 49 states had to make a decision. Do you want to have a single state police force, or do you want to break it up? Now, many states, including North Carolina, broke it up a little bit. So North Carolina has a highway patrol and an SBI. Those are our 2 primary state levels, and they're separated. And 26 states follow that. They have a highway patrol and some of their investigative unit. 23 states didn't do that. They unified the 2. So if you go to Pennsylvania, I believe, Pennsylvania has a state police, and they both do investigations and they do the type of stuff that our highway patrol does. So they assist local agencies, they investigate criminal activity statewide, they help out locally. Now, as I said, Hawaii is an exception because there's not really the same type of system. That's the current North Carolina structure of at the state level. And you can see at the very tippy top is Roy Cooper, who's our current governor. I'll let you take a look at that later when you want. Okay, here is a partial list of federal agencies and law enforcement. So just going through this quickly. U.S. Air Force Office of Special Operations, U.S. Army Investigative Division, U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, U.S. Capitol Police, in the news lately because of the January 6 hearings, Central Intelligence Agency, Coast Guard Investigative Service, Customs and Border Patrol, Criminal Defense Investigation Services, U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service, Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, Federal Protective Service, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which can be different than border, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, Marshal Service, NCIS, which have their own TV program, Office of Special Investigations, Postal Service, and U.S. Secret Service. You can see this runs all the way from the Post Office to the IRS to the Defense Department to General. So these are scattered all over the place. There are lots and lots of these agents. All right, so the 3 areas that we see them most often are in Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and Department of Treasury. Now, let me back up and talk a little bit about how they formed. After 9/11, there was this perception that a lot of law enforcement agencies hadn't talked to each other, and that had contributed to the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the would-be attack on the White House. So the argument was we needed to consolidate many of the federal law enforcement agencies under a single agency that would talk to each other and all be part of it. and that was going to be called Homeland Security. So it's the newest cabinet level official organization, department. Now the problem with that was a lot of different federal agencies were under different people, different cabinet members. So the Department of Justice is under the control of the Attorney General of the United States. The Department of Treasury is under the Secretary of Treasury. They did not want to give up power over their police departments. So there was a huge fight about should the FBI, the DEA, and others go from Department of Justice to this Homeland Security. Now, to some extent, this would make a little bit more sense. I mean, should the people that run the prosecution department also run the police? In Raleigh, for example, the district attorney's office isn't in charge of the Raleigh police. The Raleigh police are a separate agency. They cooperate. They talk to each other. But the district attorney doesn't give orders to the chief of police. At the federal level, that's exactly what happens with the FBI. The attorney general controls the FBI. So after 9/11, we have this creation of a new department, and we still have the Department of Justice and Department of Treasury. So here's Homeland Security, which probably in raw numbers has the most. And these numbers are low right now. They're higher now. So they've got border, they've got immigration, which is close to 60,000 there now. Got Secret Service, plus the Coast Guard can be under, unless it's time of war, that it goes under Department of Defense. It's got TSA, which has thousands of employees, our airport security, again, which is a result of 9/11. And then you've got FEMA, which is also under Department of Homeland Security. So it kind of got some of the power, but it didn't get a lot of the investigatory arms. Those remained outside of their control. Who kept them? Department of Justice. This is the center, really, I would say, of law enforcement at the federal level. The biggest of the big, the most famous agency, arguably the most famous police force in the world, the possible exception of Scotland Yard, is the FBI. And they have 14,000 agents and most of the resources. And it can be a very important agency, and it can be political in some ways. You know, famously under J. Edgar Hoover, it was extremely political. Now they've pulled away from that, at least publicly. But you know, you can argue that it makes political decisions even today. 14,000 agents, most resources, very, very, very famous. Got DEA, which in its heyday, when we were vigorously fighting the war on drugs, which we're still fighting, had huge numbers of people. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the U.S. Marshal Service. So you can see the Department of Justice, which is run by the Attorney General of the United States, has a lot of police working for it in one form or another. Then you got the Department of Treasury. Now this comes as a bit of a surprise for people, but the Department of Treasury has a lot of authority. The IRS, I had a very dear friend who worked for the Internal Revenue Service as an armed police officer. Believe it or not, you can get a knock on your door, and it can be, "Hi, we're from the IRS, and we're going to read you your Miranda rights." So they investigate potential criminal violations of the tax code, and there's over 3,000 of these agents. Very important agency. All right, now we're almost wrapping up here, maybe about another 5 or 7 minutes. Let's talk about private security. Because we said, okay, there's about 1 million people working in the public. Well, there's 2 million people working in private. And there are 10,000 different private security firms. Now, why? There aren't private fire departments. You wouldn't say, okay, we want a private. Now, sometimes there are private public organizations, like there's private delivery services. There's the U.S. Postal Service, and then there's Amazon and FedEx. But there's a lot of private security. It's twice as big. And some of these actually employ people that are off duty. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Certainly the latter half of the 20th century takes off. One of the reasons I think it becomes more common, first of all, that they are initially called security guards at best. sometimes private eyes. You could see them as private security. But they become a little bit more professionalized. And particularly as there's a division in wealth in the society, it can be seen as very cost effective that if I'm a wealthy man and I perceive a problem with crime, well, one thing I could do is I could go to my city council or I could go to my state government and say, hey, you need to hire more cops. Well, they may not do that, but if they do, they got to pay for them, so they might tax me. And most of that money coming from me wouldn't go directly to my own private security. So instead, what could I do? Well, I could move to or create a gated community. And I could say, in this gated community, I'm going to hire private security, and they're going to protect our homes. Now, this has certain huge advantages. First of all, it's cheaper for me than paying higher taxes. But second of all, they're under my control. So if my kid messes up, is drunk in public, the private security for my gated community's neighborhood is not going to arrest my kid because I really do pay their salary. A police officer who runs across that, you may yell at him, hey, do you know I pay taxes and that pays your salary? Trust me, they've heard that statement a million times. That's not going to make them stop arresting your kid who's drunk. Now this then raises, I think, some really interesting questions about money in the police. Are people to some extent buying police? And should that happen? I mean, we just said, well, we're okay with people buying package delivery. We're not so sure about people buying fire departments. I mean, would you want a private fire department where it only responded if you paid for them? I don't think I would. Well, what about a private police department, one that is answerable only to the people that cut their checks? And don't forget, increasingly these organizations are larger, and they're armed, and they carry out a lot of functions. We've also seen this, and we'll talk about this more when we get to corrections, where we have turned over private security or private corrections. We have private prisons. So I think these are all good questions, and they're questions that you have to answer. All right. Well, I kept it right at 50 minutes or so. When you're ready, you can go on to your next chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch you on the next show.